General Hospital spoilers reveal that Alexis carried her certainty like armor. A certainty so unwavering, so absolute, that it frightened even the people who trusted her most. She insisted Willow was innocent with a conviction that seemed to come from a place far deeper than legal knowledge or maternal instinct. Irradiated out of her, a quiet and chilling clarity that left no room for doubt. To anyone watching closely, it was as though Alexis was not merely defending Willow's innocence, she was defending a reality. She needed to exist, a truth she could not allow to be questioned. And yet, beneath the strength of her posture and the crisp logic of her arguments, there was something trembling, something raw and hidden. Something that refused to stay buried no matter how desperately she pushed it down. Because Alexis knew something no one else knew. She knew Willow was innocent not because of evidence, not because of intuition, not because of any moral reading of Willow's character. She knew it because she herself had been the one standing behind Drew that night. The one whose hands had trembled as she raised the gun. The one who had felt the recoil shudder through her bones as a bullet tore through flesh. Every time Alexis asserted Willow's innocence, she was trying to tether herself to a version of events where she was still in control, still a protector, still a mother figure who knew what was best for everyone, especially Scout. But control had a way of slipping, and guilt had a way of seeping through even the smallest fractures. The desire to regain custody of Scout had evolved from longing into obsession, from maternal love into something sharper, more desperate. Alexis told herself she was doing everything for the sake of her granddaughter, that she could provide the stability Drew refused to acknowledge, that she could undo the emotional harm caused when Drew restricted her access, and built a wall of legal boundaries around the child. But wanting Scout back was no longer a quiet ache in her heart, it had become the axis around which her motives twisted. A compass that pointed her toward increasingly dangerous rationalizations. She believed Drew had weaponized custody, turning Scout into a pawn in a game no one else admitted to playing. And Alexis believed she had simply acted to free the child from a future that would have stifled her spirit. Every time she relived the moment Drew collapsed after being shot, she told herself the same thing. She had saved Scout from a lifetime of emotional captivity. She had saved her from Drew's controlling grip, from a household that Alexis increasingly saw as cold, restrictive, and unworthy. But deep down, beneath all the layered excuses and neatly constructed explanations, Alexis knew she had crossed a threshold she could never return from. The more she insisted on Willow's innocence, the more she tried to stabilize a narrative spiraling outward from her control. She watched the investigation twist toward Curtis, then toward Michael, then back toward Willow. Each shift in suspicion felt like a noose tightening around her own neck. She stayed silent, letting the chaos swirl, letting the police chase shadows while she stood just outside the circle of blame. She had always been good with words, with timing, with shaping how others perceive the world. But this time, the lie was too large, too alive. It breathed with her, pulsed with her heartbeat, followed her like a shadow she could not escape. The weight of what she had done pressed on her chest at night. But during the day she buried it beneath determination, beneath her fierce need to protect Scout, beneath her self-crafted image of righteousness. Her belief in Willow's innocence became her shield. She wielded it with the precision of an experienced attorney, slicing through evidence with arguments that sounded impeccably logical. She reminded everyone of Willow's gentle nature, of her history, of her relationship with Drew, of her emotional state. She tore apart witness statements and insisted inconsistencies meant something else, something the investigators were missing. But the truth was simpler. Every piece of evidence used against Willow felt like a threat to Alexis herself. If the world insisted on seeing Willow as a shooter, then Alexis' lie became easier to hide, easier to blend into the confusion. But if the case shifted, if detectives dug deeper, if someone caught a detail she missed, if anyone saw her near the scene, everything she built would collapse. Control was the only thing keeping her sane. Alexis had spent years rebuilding herself from the ruins of bad decisions, bad relationships, lost opportunities, and lingering guilt. She had crafted a version of herself that was stable, respectable, strong. She had fought her demons and insisted she had emerged better, wiser. But this new secret, this unspeakable act, was eroding that identity grain by grain. She was no longer the woman who fought for justice. She was the woman who had shot an unarmed man in the back. The truth was an infection slowly spreading beneath the skin of her life, threatening to tear everything open. And still, she was convinced she could manage it. She always believed she could manage everything. She believed she could shape outcomes, navigate chaos, and dictate how the story would unfold. But in trying to control the narrative, she lost control of herself. Small cracks began to appear, moments of hesitation, sudden bursts of intensity, rare flashes of fear behind her eyes. People started to whisper about how invested she seemed in clearing Willow. Some felt touched by her loyalty, others found it suspicious. But none of them knew how deep the truth ran. How much of her identity hinged on the lie she was clinging to so tightly? Every time Scout was mentioned, Alexis felt the same tug inside her, a mixture of love and guilt that made her stomach twist. She told herself she deserved to be in the child's life. She told herself she was the only one who could offer Scout the love and emotional stability she needed. But the more she clung to that belief, the more she seemed to unravel. Her determination to regain custody had mutated into something else, something darker. It was no longer about protection, it was about claiming ownership over the one relationship she believed she had not destroyed. The secret began to bleed into her everyday choices. She started overanalyzing every detail of the case, every shift in public opinion, every whisper of new evidence. She studied the detective's expressions during interviews, watched the way other characters spoke about Drew, about Willow, about the night of the shooting. Every change in tone felt like a warning. Every unanswered question felt like a trap. She lived in constant vigilance, always anticipating the moment someone would look at her a second too long, or ask a question she could not easily dismiss. The guilt didn't break her, it fueled her. It made her work harder, think faster, manipulate more subtly. She crafted her days with the precision of someone trying to outrun their own shadow. But she could feel the walls closing in. Secrets always had a way of expanding, filling every corner of a person's life until there was no room left to breathe. And Alexis was running out of corners. Her insistence on Willow's innocence began to sound less like advocacy, and more like pleading with fate. She needed the world to believe Willow was incapable of violence, because that belief helped suppress the truth clawing at the inside of her chest. The more the investigation heated up, the more Alexis felt the old ache of losing control. The same ache she felt when Drew pushed her out of Scout's life. The same ache that led her to the moment she now regretted but could never undo. The reality was closing in on her. She had fired the shot that nearly killed Drew. She had done it in a moment of fear, anger, instinct, and desperation. She had convinced herself she acted for Scout, that she had prevented harm instead of causing it. But the truth beneath that truth, the truth she refused to examine, was that she acted because she could not stand feeling powerless anymore. She acted because she could not bear losing the one person left, who made her feel connected to something meaningful. She acted because she wanted to reclaim a piece of her life she believed Drew had taken away. And now, the secrets she thought she could manage were beginning to crack under the pressure of investigatio. And the more she tried to direct the narrative, the more it slipped like sand between her fingers. People were starting to sense something was off. The clues she thought she erased were not as clean as she hoped. The shadows she hidden were shrinking. The mistakes she prayed were invisible were gaining shape, becoming harder to ignore. Alexis had always survived through cleverness, resilience, and sheer stubborn will. But this time the stakes were different. This time the truth was not a distant threat, it was a presence breathing down her neck, whispering that every step she took might be the one that exposed her. And the chilling part was that Alexis herself no longer knew whether she feared exposure because of the legal consequences, or because it would force her to confront the version of herself she had become. Her belief in Willow's innocence was more than strategy, more than logic, more than maternal empathy. If Willow was guilty, then Alexis could still claim to be a victim of circumstance. But if Willow was innocent as she truly knew, then the truth of what she had done would swallow her whole. And in the quiet moments when she let her guard loosen for a breath too long, she felt the inevitable future drawing nearer. Secrets did not stay buried forever. Lies did not stay intact forever. And control was nothing more than a fragile illusion, slipping little by little as the truth pressed harder from beneath the surface. Alexis knew that one day, everything she had hidden would shatter in the light. And the terrifying part was that she no longer knew whether she feared the truth for what it would reveal about her or for what it would take away. Alexis had always believed she understood the anatomy of desperation. She had lived through enough storms, emotional, legal, familial, to recognize when someone had crossed the invisible line between determination and obsession. But she never imagined she would be the one crossing it, moving past it, and then continuing to walk until the world behind her felt unrecognizable. What began as a quiet ache to be closer to Scout and Danny had grown into something sprawling and uncontrollable, something that clung to her like a restless presence, whispering that she was running out of time, out of chances, out of pieces of family she could still call her own. The farther she slipped from reason, the more she convinced herself that her urgency was justified, that everything she was doing, every risk, every deception, every quiet wrong turn was in service of Sam's children, the last fragile remnants of a life she once shared with her daughter before the world shifted and left her standing alone in the wreckage. The desire to regain custody was the origin point, but it was no longer a simple desire. It had become the air she breathed and a lens through which she interpreted everything around her. When Drew restricted her access to Scout, Alexis felt something break inside her, a soft, painful sound no one else could hear. She had done everything she could to rebuild her life, to restore stability, to reclaim her role as a mother and grandmother whose influence mattered. Yet Drew had judged her, sentenced her, and carried out a kind of emotional execution by removing her from Scout's daily world. Every time she remembered the moment the court order was handed down, she felt the same suffocating pressure in her chest, a mixture of humiliation, grief, and a rage she tried desperately to recast as love. She told herself she fought for Scout because Sam would want her to. She told herself she was righting a wrong. In truth, she could no longer distinguish between devotion and desperation. Her fixation on protecting Sam's legacy was a story she used to soothe herself, a narrative woven tightly enough that she could hide inside it without facing the darker truth. Sam's life had been filled with dangers, sacrifices, and unfinished chapters. Danny and Scout were the living extensions of those chapters, the last things that made Sam's absence bearable. Alexis feared that if she lost them too, the fragile connection holding her together would snap. And so she clung to the idea that she alone understood what Sam would have wanted. She alone knew how to preserve the emotional inheritance her daughter left behind. She alone could prevent Drew from molding the children into something unrecognizable, into something Sam wouldn't have wanted them to become. It never occurred to Alexis that her version of Sam's legacy was just that, her version. She believed so fiercely in her own narrative that it became the only reality she recognized. The further she went, the more the world around her began to warp. Danny's distance no longer felt like a natural shift in a teenager's life but an omen. Scout's fading memories of their past together felt like betrayal. Every photograph, every toy, every scrap of Sam's handwriting became precious evidence that she alone understood the importance of the children's emotional heritage. She needed to gather them back into her orbit, needed to reclaim what she believed had been stolen from her. That urgency pulsed inside her like a second heartbeat, restless, loud, unstoppable. And then came the shooting. That night had become a knot in the timeline of her life, tight, messy, impossible to pull apart. She had replayed it so often that the memory no longer unfolded in linear time but in flashes. The bitter cold on her skin, the metallic taste of fear, the way her hand trembled even though she told herself it wouldn't. The sharp crack of the gun in the darkness. Alexis had told herself 1,000 times that she didn't intend to pull the trigger, that she only wanted to scare Drew, force him to reconsider, frighten him into loosening his grip on the children. She told herself she acted in a moment of emotional extremity, pushed by grief she never fully processed. And yet, each time her mind replayed the moment, the excuses grew thinner and more fragile, until even she had trouble believing them. Her guilt should have destroyed her. Instead, it transformed her. Rather than collapsing beneath it, she redirected the weight inward, shaping it into a shield. She used her guilt to fuel her determination, to justify her newfound vigilance, to rationalize every extreme step she took after that night. The moment she learned Willow was a prime suspect, Alexis felt an electric jolt of terror and relief all at once. Someone else was being blamed. Someone innocent. But the investigation had aligned so neatly with the lie she needed to protect, that she let it happen. And once she let it happen, she knew she was no longer simply lying, she was architecting the path forward. Her insistence on Willow's innocence became her armor and her alibi simultaneously. She built her arguments with emotional precision, weaving logic and empathy into a case convincing enough that even seasoned investigators hesitated. But each time she defended Willow, she felt the truth inside her rattle like a secret begging to be released. Only she refused to release it. She needed the world to believe Willow was incapable of such violence, because her entire survival depended on that belief. If Willow was guilty, Alexis could fade into obscurity. If Willow was innocent as Alexis truly knew, then the spotlight might eventually shift back to her. So she sharpened her advocacy into a kind of performance, one so polished that it even frightened her. She was defending Willow because she believed in her innocence, but she was also defending herself, her guilt, her secret, her future. The shift in the investigation from Willow to Curtis to Michael gave Alexis momentary reprieve, but also deepened her paranoia. Every time suspicion changed direction, she felt the tightening grip of fate closing around her throat. Each wrong turn the police took, each theory that dragged them farther from the truth, brought a moment of relief but also added another layer of instability. She began to obsess over small details in the case, over the detectives' expressions, over the inconsistencies in their reports. She absorbed every whisper, every rumor, every ripple of public opinion. The story was changing faster than she could control it, and control was the one thing she was losing. Her mind, once sharp and disciplined, began to fracture into two worlds. One world was a persona she showed to others, calm, logical, deeply invested in clearing Willow, deeply protective of Scout and Danny. The other world was the one she kept hidden, filled with spiraling fear, jolting memories, and the crushing awareness that the truth was not staying buried. The guilt had become a living entity inside her. It shifted, stretched, pressed against her ribs from the inside, reminding her that she couldn't outrun what she had done. She began interpreting every conversation, every glance, every ambiguous comment through the filter of her secret. She wondered constantly if someone had seen her that night, if someone had followed her, if someone had sensed something off in her behavior. She memorized her own lies so thoroughly she began to speak them with startling ease. She studied her body language in the mirror to make sure there were no cracks. But secrets had a weight and a scent and a pulse of their own, and theirs always seeped out eventually. Her obsession over custody deepened in parallel with her fear. The more she believed she might one day be exposed, the more urgently she believed she had to secure Scout and Danny before that happened. It was no longer enough to be part of their lives, she needed them legally bound to her again. She needed to restore a world where she belonged, where she mattered, where she could rewrite the shame of her past mistakes. She could feel herself slipping into a psychological territory. She once would have warned her clients about territory where desperation rewrites morality, where love becomes justification, where fear becomes strategy. What startled her most, though, was how natural the transformation felt. She wasn't horrified by her actions the way she should have been. She wasn't drowning in remorse. Instead, she felt something almost like clarity, as though she had discovered a part of herself she had always kept suffocated beneath layers of restraint. This Alexis was fierce, unstoppable, and terrifyingly willing to do whatever it took. She had spent her life trying to rebuild from the damage she had caused, but now she found herself surrendering to the darker instincts she thought she had outgrown. And that was the true shock underlying everything. The realization that she was capable of becoming exactly the kind of person she had spent her life trying not to be. The truth was that she did not lose control the night she shot Drew. She discovered it. She found a kind of twisted empowerment in that moment, one that terrified her even as it steadied her. She felt as though she had reclaimed something that had been stolen from her, a sense of agency, of possession, of maternal entitlement, but that feeling was hollowing her out from within. Now, each new day felt like walking along the edge of a widening fracture. Her obsession with custody, her fear of exposure, her guilt and her denial, they were all converging into a perfect storm. She could feel the world tilting, tipping her closer and closer to a truth she could no longer hide from. The secrets she had buried so desperately were rising, pushing against the surface of her life, waiting for the moment everything would erupt. Alexis told herself she was fighting for her family. But underneath the noble reasoning, the painful truth was forming like a bruise. She was fighting to protect herself. She was fighting to preserve the illusion that she was still the hero of her own story. But her reflection in the mirror was changing, her decisions growing more reckless, her conscience quieter with each passing day. And somewhere deep inside her, she knew the truth was coming. She felt it in the way her hands shook when she saw Drew. She felt it in the way Scout looked at her with growing confusion. She felt it in the silence between her heartbeat and her thoughts. The story was spiraling beyond her control. The lies were evolving into something monstrous. The obsession was tightening its grip around her. And Alexis, once the voice of reason, once the moral compass of those around her, was becoming someone no one recognized, not even herself. The shock was not just that Alexis had shot Drew. The shock was how easily she was becoming the kind of person who could do it again. Alexis had always known how to redirect suspicion, how to shift the weight of guilt from one person to another without leaving fingerprints behind. But now, as the investigation tightened around the shooting of Drew, her tactics had grown sharper, faster, and far more dangerous. She began subtly pushing the narrative toward Tracy and Michael, suggesting through carefully placed comments and quiet insinuations that the two had motives worth revisiting. She spoke of Tracy's ruthlessness as if it were a natural extension of violence, and of Michael's growing paranoia as though it were a warning sign everyone had missed. It was a calculated move, born not of malice but of survival, a way to keep eyes turned away from the one place she could not allow them to look at her. Blaming Tracy was easy. Tracy's history practically begged for suspicion. Her long-standing grudges, her involvement in family wars, her tangled business influence. Alexis wielded those facts like shadows. She could scatter across the investigation whenever the detectives came too close. And Michael, spiraling under pressure and haunted by his own secrets, made an ideal second target. Alexis painted him as unstable, emotionally volatile, perhaps even desperate enough to lash out at Drew in a moment of panic. People listened. People nodded. People wondered. And Alexis felt a momentary flicker of relief each time someone whispered that maybe Michael knew more than he admitted, that maybe Tracy's influence stretched farther than anyone realized. But this so-called relief was fragile, thin, and fleeting, because Turner was watching. Turner, whose instincts had been sharpened by years of facing down half-truths and masked motives, had begun studying Alexis the way one studies the corner of a puzzle. where something doesn't quite fit. He noticed the timing of her accusations, the way she nudged suspicion toward others with too much ease. He noticed how she always had just the right information, just the right emotional reasoning, just the right narrative to shift the room's energy away from herself. What she thought were subtle maneuvers, Turner saw as patterns. And patterns in a case like this were invitations to dig deeper. The closer Turner came to the truth, the more Alexis felt the walls closing in. She could feel the pressure building behind her ribs, a tightness that made breathing uneven. Her mind began racing through every moment since the shooting, every slip of emotion, every fragment of fear she might have let slip in front of the wrong person. The guilt she tried to hide was beginning to seep through the cracks in her composure, forming a dark halo around her every action. She could feel Turner's attention like a weight on her shoulders, as though he were slowly tightening a rope around the secret she carried. The more Turner observed her, the more Alexis found herself spiraling. The obsession that had driven her to protect Scout and Danny now twisted into something darker. An obsession with preserving the lie at any cost. She replayed conversations in her mind, searching for weaknesses in her own words. She analyzed Turner's questions, trying to read whether he was testing her or simply probing the edges of the case. She watched Tracy and Michael with a mix of dread and justification, telling herself that if either of them fell under suspicion, it would keep the truth buried a little longer. But Turner was not distracted. If anything, Alexis' attempts to shift suspicion made him more certain that she was hiding something significant. He began piecing together inconsistencies in her version of events, moments when her logic was to clean, her certainty to rehearsed. He questioned why she was so deeply invested in clearing Willow when no one had asked it of her. He wondered why Alexis reacted so sharply whenever the conversation drifted to close. To Drew's final moments before the shooting, Turner sensed a story buried between the cracks of her calm exterior. An instinct told him that once he pulled at the right thread, everything would unravel. And this was what terrified Alexis most, the inevitability of discovery. She knew Turner well enough to understand that he did not let go once he caught the scent of a lie. She knew he would keep pushing, keep digging, keep circling her until the truth emerged whether she wanted it to or not. The fear that had once been a shadow now throbbed inside her like a living thing, pushing her toward more frantic decisions, more reckless deflections. Yet even in her panic, she could not stop blaming Tracy and Michael. It had become a reflex now, a way to redirect the rising suspicion scraping at her heels. The more trapped she felt, the more aggressively she shifted the narrative. If she could just keep Turner chasing shadows a little longer, if she could get one more person to believe her version, if she could divert the investigation just one more time, maybe she could survive this. But deep down, Alexis already sensed the truth she refused to admit. She was running out of places to hide. Turner was getting closer, closer than anyone had come before. And the secret she carried was no longer a sleeping monster but a breathing one, awake, restless, and hungry for escape. And once Turner uncovered what she had done, no amount of blame, no amount of deflection, no amount of carefully crafted lies would be enough to stop the darkness from swallowing everything she still hoped to protect.